Welcome back to the Old Shed Workshop. I'm Mike. If you've seen my video on how I make hexagon-shaped coasters, you'll see that I take a piece of hardwood. Typically, I use cherry. I cut it, I put it in a mold, and I pour epoxy resin. When I remove the workpiece from the mold, now I have to trim it and cut it into the hexagon shapes. So today, I've finally gotten a little time to get to the jig that I made to cut the hexagons. If this is your first time here, I'll invite you to like and subscribe. Hit the button for notifications for future videos. You guys out there that have been liking and subscribing and spending some time to watch my videos have really helped me to grow my channel. So let's get right to how I made this jig. This jig starts with a piece of 3/4 inch plywood that's approximately 2 feet by 2 feet. As with many videos you've probably already seen on YouTube, first thing we have to do is make sure you have squared up sides, which you can do against the fence on your table saw. After that, you got it squared up. You don't need the fence anymore at all. I start out after squaring up the piece to add some HDPE or high density polyethylene runners on the bottom of the piece of plywood that's going to become my jig. In order to do this, you may have seen other videos on YouTube where you put a couple of washers or you put a couple of dimes in your miter slots. So when you put the HDPE runners on top, they sit a little proud of the surface of the table saw. Once you have the washers and the HDPE runners sitting on top of the washers and you're ready to glue it with your CA glue and your activator, all you have to do is square up this edge. Okay, square up the edge to the edge of your table saw. So now you got 90 degrees. You have the edge of your plywood on this side and you have the runners in the miter slots this way. Once you're lined up, put your CA glue down on the runner, put your piece in place as long as it's lined up even with the edge of your table saw, and hold it in a few seconds. After you've placed the activator on, give it a few seconds to dry. Then you countersink and set some screws to keep them in place. That's all there is to the bottom of the jig. When you flip it over, now those HDPE runners are going to sit in the miter slots on your table saw, and you have to set the piece of wood so that you're going to cut with the table saw blade down the middle of the plywood. Having said that, the next thing you have to do is determine your angle. I can tell you that on a hexagon is 360 degrees, just like a circle. You have 6 sides at 360 degrees. That's 60 degrees per side. 60 times 6 is 360 degrees. So in order to get this angle, you got 60 degrees twice. That means your angle has to be 120 degrees. In order to get 120 degrees to cut these hexagons, the first thing you have to do is mount a piece. This is just scrap 1/2 inch plywood. Mount a piece at 60 degrees from the edge of your plywood. In order to do that, I have a digital protractor. If you set it up on the edge of your plywood, make sure you have it square on the edge, and you set this to 60 degrees. That's where you're going to mount your first piece. Okay? This is 60 degrees. Hopefully you can see that angle. It's right at 60 degrees. Now that I have 60 degrees, I have to have 120 degrees. So what I did, using this first piece, once it's determined that I have 60 degrees accurately, I glue it, I put a few screws in it, that piece is done. Using a router with a 3/4 inch wide bit, you can use this as your guide for the router. Determine how far out you want to come. This isn't mission critical. You can make it whatever you want. I cut a slot to put some T-track in, set the T-track in flush, put a few screws in it. Now I can make my sliding piece that I need to create 120 degrees. To get 120 degrees, since I already have 60 here, I need an additional 60 from this 60 to make 120. The 120 gives you your hexagonal shape. Okay? So I cut this piece at 60 degrees. These cuts don't mean anything. They're just where I cut off excess wood off the piece I used for my guide. Once you have this determined to be 60 degrees, now you're ready to make your cut in the middle of your jig. Raising your table saw blade up just above the level of the plywood, you want to come down and cut into the fixed piece. It's the piece that does not move. Just cut into it a short distance. Okay, that's all you need. Once you have your 60 degrees here, 60 degrees here, that gives you your first cut, 120 degrees. I'm setting my adjustable piece to one of my previously cut hexagons to show you that when I cut through, I got 60 here, I got 60 here, 120 degrees. I cut a straight edge, but before I cut, I don't want to have my fingers here. I put a toggle clamp. I know I'm going to get feedback in the comments that it's dangerous to cut towards the toggle clamp. I can tell you that this is my jig. This works for me. There are alternatives to this. If you don't want to put a clamp, you could put the clamp over this way. You could use a pencil eraser. If you have one of these rubber cleaning bars to clean your sander, you could use that. This works for me. You're not going anywhere past the edge of that hexagon, or what's going to become the hexagon. This works for me. You're not comfortable with that, do it an alternative way. Maybe put the toggle clamp so it's going in this direction. Whatever works for you. I'm just trying to give you the idea of how I made this jig to cut the hexagons. Using a piece of T-track, a T-nut that I had in stock with a T-bolt, piece of scrap wood, a toggle bolt, a piece of scrap 1/2 inch plywood, and a nice piece of 3/4 inch plywood, approximately 2 feet by 2 feet. That's how you can make your jig for cutting hexagons. In addition, what I did here, if you watch my video on how I made the hexagons, you'll see that I cut the piece, I put it in the mold. So these are the 2 pieces of wood in the mold. And then I pour the epoxy. So what I did is I cut a strip of plywood. And in order to make sure I was doing it correctly, I made measurements and I tried to mimic the same shape and size of the piece that was coming out of my mold after I poured the epoxy resin. So I had this long piece of scrap plywood. This is a 1/2 inch plywood that I used. And you can see how I started making test hexagons. Here's another one. I cut this piece of wood, this piece of wood. This is the amount of epoxy that I poured. And I wanted to make sure I had the flips and the cuts all correct. So I made these test strips of plywood where I mimicked the pour. That's how I got to making exact cuts for the size of the hexagon coasters that I wanted. In addition, if you want to make a larger hexagon, you're making a wall decoration or whatever it may be, you can cut a pretty large hexagon using this jig without having to change anything else, just by moving the movable piece on the T-track. Nothing changes other than the movement and the size of the hexagon. The angle remains the same. The angle will remain at 120 degrees no matter how you slide this. All it's going to change is the size of the hexagon. The last thing you need to have to complete the jig is a handle. In order to make a handle, I took a piece of a scrap 2x4, I ripped it in half, and I glued it and screwed it from the bottom to make my handle. This keeps your hands completely away from the blade as you cut through your workpiece. If you don't like the position of a toggle clamp, you don't feel comfortable with it, as the blade comes through and you stop, you can use an alternative method. This is just my idea. So I hope this has been helpful. Appreciate you staying through the building of this jig, and we'll see you on the next one.